The night Lord Pemberton announced the engagement, the Duke of Ashford raised his glass and smiled at the room. He did not look at her once. Vivienne Cavendish stood 3 feet away from him in a dress the color of winter cream, with her mother's diamonds at her throat and 3 years of patience behind her eyes, and she watched him smile at the room, at the chandelier, at the wallpaper, at the general warm blur of 200 people who had come to celebrate something he was treating like a business transaction successfully concluded, and she thought, he doesn't know I'm here. Not in the way of a man who is distracted. In the way of a man who has never quite decided that she is real. She had told herself for 3 years that it didn't matter, that marriages were arrangements and arrangements were practical and practical was what she had been raised to be. She had told herself that warmth could be learned, that attention could be cultivated, that a man who did not see her yet might, in time, learn to look. That was the first lie. The second lie came 40 minutes later when Lord Pemberton's nephew, young, slightly drunk, cheerfully oblivious, turned to James and said, "And this must be the lady. I don't believe we've been introduced." And James, her fiancé of 3 years, the man she had sat beside at 14 dinner tables and walked beside in 4 different gardens and nursed through a fever that had frightened everyone who saw it, opened his mouth. And stopped. 1 second. 2. "This is 3. Miss Cavendish," he said finally, her surname just her surname. Vivienne smiled at the nephew. She said something pleasant. She moved away through the crowd with her champagne glass and her mother's diamonds and her 3 years of patience, and she did not look back. But she thought, very clearly, with the particular clarity that arrives at the end of something, enough. That is enough. The Pemberton house in Mayfair was exactly the kind of house that had been designed to make people feel that they were in the right place. High ceilings, good plasterwork, enough candlelight to be flattering without being theatrical, the kind of Persian carpet that had been there long enough to seem inevitable. Vivienne had been in this house 11 times she had counted, in the way she counted everything, methodically and without sentimentality, and she had never once felt that she was in the right place. She felt generally that she was performing being in the right place, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more exhausting. Tonight was no exception. She had arrived with her parents at 8:30, her father in his good coat, her mother in the gray silk she kept for occasions that required dignity rather than beauty, a distinction her mother made with great precision, and that Vivienne had always found quietly heartbreaking. They had been announced. They had moved through the entrance hall. Her father had immediately located Lord Pemberton and begun a conversation about something financial. Her mother had immediately located Lady Harwood and begun a conversation about something social. And Vivienne had been left, as she frequently was at these occasions, to navigate the room on her own. She was good at it. She had been doing it since she was 17. She found a position near the second window, far enough from the fireplace to be cool, close enough to the door to observe arrivals, with a clear sightline to most of the room. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She smiled at the 3 people who greeted her, spoke briefly and pleasantly to 2 of them, and allowed the third, Lady Elton, who talked extensively and required nothing in return, to talk for 4 minutes before a natural pause presented itself, and Vivienne excused herself gracefully. Then she found James. He was across the room, near the far wall, in conversation with a group of men she recognized in the way one recognizes furniture in a house one visits regularly, by position and outline rather than particular detail. He was in profile to her. Dark coat, white cravat, the particular way he held himself that had always suggested to Vivienne a man braced for something, though she had never been able to determine what. He had not seen her arrive. This was not unusual. She had stopped expecting him to look for her in rooms approximately 18 months ago, when she had finally acknowledged to herself, in the quiet, unflinching way she acknowledged difficult things, that he didn't. It was not cruelty. She was fairly certain of that. It was something more impersonal than cruelty. It was the particular blindness of a man who moved through the world looking at the general shape of things and had never quite focused on the specific. She watched him for a moment. Then she looked away and went to find someone interesting to talk to. Lord Pemberton made the announcement at 9 o'clock. He was a cheerful man who enjoyed occasions, and he made the announcement with the warm expansiveness of someone who considers a good engagement a personal achievement. He said several things about the Ashford family and several things about the Cavendish family and several things about the particular felicity of the match. He said James's name 3 times and Vivienne's name twice, which she counted automatically and without meaning to. The room applauded. James raised his glass. Vivienne raised hers. Their eyes met across the room briefly, correctly, and James inclined his head in the slight, formal way of a man, acknowledging a social obligation fulfilled. Vivienne inclined hers in return. Someone near her said, "What a lovely couple," and someone else said, "She looks very well," and Vivienne smiled at both of them and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed over the years and found extremely useful. Then James moved toward her, or rather, moved in her general direction, which resulted in them being in proximity, which was close to the same thing but not quite. And she crossed the last few feet herself and stood beside him, and the room continued its warm, congratulatory business all around them. "Vivienne," he said it correctly. Her name full and clear, the way it was supposed to sound. She looked at him. For a moment, one unguarded moment, before she could arrange her expression into something more neutral, she felt the thing she always felt when he said her name properly. A small, involuntary warmth, embarrassing in its persistence, the warmth of a person who has been waiting to be seen and cannot help responding when something approximating it occurs. "Stop," she told herself. "Stop doing that." "James," she said, "it's a lovely party." "Pemberton does this sort of thing well," he agreed. They stood together. Around them, people moved and talked and laughed and clinked glasses. Someone told a story that made the group nearby erupt. A woman in a yellow dress crossed the room with great purpose. 2 elderly men argued companionably about something that sounded like it might be horses. James said nothing further. Vivienne said nothing further. This was, she thought, a reasonable portrait of their engagement. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that Lord Pemberton's nephew found them. Or found James, more precisely. He came toward James with the slightly unfocused warmth of a young man who has had enough champagne to feel that everyone is his friend, and that introductions are a delightful formality rather than a social requirement. "Ashford," he said, clapping James on the shoulder with the casual confidence of someone a decade his junior. "Tremendous evening, tremendous, and this," he turned, beaming to Vivienne, "this must be the lady. Don't believe we've been properly introduced." Vivienne smiled at him. "I don't believe we have," she said. The nephew looked at James with the expectant expression of someone waiting for the obvious. James opened his mouth. The room did not go quiet. The party continued around them. Music, laughter, the clink of crystal. 200 people doing what 200 people do at a party when they are comfortable and well-fed, and celebrating something that doesn't particularly concern them. The world did not stop, but something in Vivienne's chest went very still. She watched James's face. She had been watching his face for 3 years. She knew its vocabulary, the slight tension at the jaw when he was bored, the particular quality of his attention when something genuinely interested him, the controlled blankness he deployed in difficult conversations. She knew this face the way you know a text you have read many times, not always correctly, not always completely, but with a familiarity that goes past effort into something more automatic. She watched his face now, and she saw it. The pause, the fractional widening, the almost imperceptible internal search, the look of a man reaching for something that should be immediately to hand and finding the shelf unexpectedly bare. 1 second. 2. "This is 3. Miss Cavendish," he said. Her surname. Clean and correct and entirely, completely wrong, wrong in the way that a technically accurate statement can be the worst possible answer, worse than silence, worse than anything he might have fumbled toward, because it told her precisely what she had suspected and had been telling herself for months was not true. He had reached for her name and found her surname first. Because her name, her actual name, the name her mother had given her, the name she had been called every day of her life for 26 years, had not been where it should have been. The nephew, oblivious and cheerful, took her hand and bowed over it and said something gallant that she answered correctly and did not hear. James said something. She answered that too. The conversation moved on the way conversations do, indifferent to the small disasters that occur inside them. Vivienne smiled. She was very good at smiling. 40 minutes later, she found a quiet corner near the back of the room, a small alcove off the main salon, half hidden by a large arrangement of hothouse flowers that smelled, she thought, slightly too sweet, the way things do when they have been forced to bloom before they were ready. She stood there for a moment. She was not going to cry. She was not a woman who cried at parties or in front of other people or over things she had seen coming for long enough that she should have been prepared. She had prepared. She was prepared. She was also, and she allowed herself to know this, quietly and without drama, the way she allowed herself to know all the difficult things, very tired. Tired of performing being in the right place. Tired of the careful smile and the pleasant answers and the 3 years of patience that had been, she understood now, not patience at all. It had been hope dressed up as patience. Hope that he would look. Hope that he would learn her. Hope that the single time he had said her name, Vivienne, just once in the summer house, to no one in particular, had meant something, had been the beginning of something, had been a door opening rather than a coincidence closing. Enough, she had thought, across the room 3 feet away from him. She thought it again now in the alcove with the 2 sweet flowers and the party going on without her. Enough. She finished her champagne. She straightened her back. She went back into the room. She did not speak to James again that evening. He did not seek her out. This too was not unusual. Her mother found her at 10:30 and said she looked tired and asked if she wanted to go. Vivienne said she was fine. Her mother looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who knows her daughter is not fine and has learned over 26 years that saying so accomplishes nothing. She patted Vivienne's hand once and went back to Lady Harwood. At 11 o'clock, Vivienne retrieved her wrap and said her goodbyes and was handed into the family carriage and sat in the dark on the way home while the city moved past the windows and her parents discussed the party in the mild, pleasant tones of people who had found the evening satisfactory. She looked out the window. She thought about the pause. 1 second, 2, 3. She thought about the shelf and the missing name and the surname offered in its place like a substitute that was technically correct and entirely insufficient. She thought, he has been engaged to me for 3 years. She thought, he does not know my name. She thought, what are you going to do about that, Vivienne? Outside, London went on in the dark, lit windows and wet cobblestones and the sound of other people's evenings, and the carriage carried her home and she sat with the question all the way there. She did not have an answer yet, but she was, for the first time in 3 years, asking it, and that, she thought, was the beginning of something. She wasn't sure what, but it was something. She had been patient. She had been invisible. She had been, for 3 years, a name he couldn't find when he needed it. That was over now. The only question was what came next. The morning after the engagement party, Vivienne woke early. This was not unusual. She had been an early riser since childhood. Her mother called it a virtue, her father called it inconvenient, and Vivienne called it simply the way she was built, the way some people are built for parties and others for the quiet before them. She dressed without ringing for her maid, which was also not unusual, and went down to the small sitting room at the back of the house where the morning light came in from the east, and the household had not yet fully woken, and the day had not yet become anything in particular. She made herself tea. She sat down. She thought. She had been thinking in one form or another about James Ashford since she was 14 years old. Not always voluntarily, not always kindly, but consistently, with the particular consistency of something that has been placed at the center of your future and cannot therefore be moved to the periphery of your mind. no matter how many times you try. She had been 17 when the arrangement was formalized. Not announced. It was not the kind of thing that got announced at 17, with the girl still in the schoolroom and the Duke still managing a grief that had not fully resolved itself, and everyone involved preferring the language of understanding to the language of contract. But formalized, nonetheless. Papers were involved. Conversations between fathers were had in rooms that daughters were not invited into. And then her father had come to find her in the garden and sat down beside her on the bench near the roses and told her, in the careful measured way he told her difficult things, what had been decided. Vivienne had listened. She had asked 3 questions. When, what was expected of her in the interim, and whether she had any recourse if she found the situation intolerable. Her father had answered the first 2 questions directly and paused for a long time before answering the third. The situation, he had said finally, is not expected to be intolerable, which was not, she had noted, an answer. She had said, I see, and she had gone back to her book. James Ashford had been, in those early years, a largely theoretical presence. She knew him by reputation before she knew him in person, which was, she had come to understand, the way most people knew the Duke of Ashford. The reputation was substantial and not unkind. A serious man, an intelligent man, a man who had inherited young and managed well and conducted himself with the kind of controlled competence that society rewarded with respect if not particular warmth. He was not known for warmth. He was known for correctness, for capability, for a certain quality of contained authority that people found reassuring in a duke and would have found, she suspected, somewhat unnerving in anyone else. She had met him for the first time at a dinner at the Pemberton house, her father's doing, a careful arrangement dressed as coincidence, and she had watched him across the table for most of the evening and thought, he is exactly what I expected, and I don't yet know if that is good or not. He had spoken to her twice, once to ask whether she found London agreeable after the country, and once to pass the salt. Both times he had been correct and pleasant and entirely, completely elsewhere. She had gone home and written in her journal. She had kept a journal since she was 12, precise and unsentimental. A single line, he looks at rooms, not people, rooms. She had underlined it. She had not known then how long she would spend thinking about that line. The arrangement itself was straightforward as these things went. The Cavendish family had money, considerable money, new money, the kind that had been made in trade 2 generations ago and had since been very thoroughly laundered through the correct schools and the correct houses and the correct marriages until it smelled, to most people's satisfaction, sufficiently old. What it did not have, and what the Ashford name provided in abundance, was the particular weight of centuries, title, land. The kind of social solidity that money alone, however much of it, could not purchase outright. The Ashford family, conversely, had all of that and very little else. The estate was encumbered. The investments had not performed. The late Duke James's father, dead 8 years, had been a man of expensive tastes and insufficient discipline, and the inheritance he had left his son was considerably more complicated than the one he had received. James had spent the first years of his dukedom managing the consequences with the focused, relentless competence that was apparently the one thing the Ashford men passed reliably from father to son. The arrangement solved both problems neatly. Vivienne had understood this from the beginning. She was not a romantic, or rather, she had been a romantic at 14 and had made the pragmatic decision, somewhere around 16, to put it aside as an indulgence she could not afford. She understood that marriages of this kind were not about love. They were about stability, continuity, the management of adjacent interests. She had no objection to this in principle. Her objection, which she had been carefully not articulating for 3 years, was different. It was not that James didn't love her. She had not expected love. It was that he didn't see her. There was a distinction, and it mattered enormously, and she was not sure she could explain it to anyone who had not felt it. The difference between being in a room with someone and being present to them. The difference between being known as Miss Cavendish and being known as Vivienne, between being an arrangement and being a person. She had been telling herself for 3 years that this would change. That proximity would create familiarity, and familiarity would create something warmer, that he was a contained man who opened slowly. That patience was not the same as resignation. She had believed this. Until last night in the alcove with the 2 sweet flowers, when she had looked at the thing she'd been not looking at for 3 years, and found it exactly the size and shape she had always, underneath everything, suspected it was. It was the summer of the first year that she always came back to. The Ashford country house in Wiltshire, a large, pale stone house that sat in a valley and caught the evening light beautifully and was, Vivienne had thought on first seeing it, the kind of house that deserved to be loved and probably wasn't. She had been there for a fortnight at the Duchess's invitation, James's mother, formidable and watchful, who had looked at Vivienne on arrival with the expression of a woman conducting an assessment and had said at the end of the first evening, "You'll do," which Vivienne had understood was high praise. James had been there. Distant, correct, present in the physical sense without being present in any other. And then on the 4th day he had become ill. It had come on quickly, a fever, high and sudden, the kind that arrives before anyone is prepared for it. The household had mobilized with the efficient alarm of people accustomed to managing a duke's inconveniences, and the doctor had been sent for, and James had been put to bed in his room with instructions to rest, and the guests had been politely dispersed, and the Duchess, herself unwell with a summer cold, had retreated to her own rooms, and the house had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a place that is waiting to see what happens next. Vivienne had stayed. No one asked her to. No one told her not to. She simply stayed. She sent a note to her mother explaining the situation. She changed her dress for something more practical, and she went to the sick room and knocked, and the nurse who answered looked at her with surprise and then, after a moment's calculation, stepped aside. She stayed for 3 days. She read to him. He slept most of the time, but she read anyway, quietly, because she thought the sound of a voice might be better than silence, and silence seemed to be what he had too much of normally. She opened the window when the room became too close. She learned, over those 3 days, the geography of his discomfort, that he slept better on his left side, that the afternoon light bothered him, that he didn't want water unless it had been brought to room temperature first, which she had figured out herself by watching and had mentioned to the nurse without making anything of it. He had been in illness a different version of himself, less managed, less braced. Once, in the middle of the second night when the fever was at its height and she had been sitting in the chair beside the bed half asleep herself, he had said something she couldn't make out, and she had said, "It's all right," without thinking, and he had gone still. In the morning he didn't mention it. She didn't either. When he recovered, on the 4th day, he had come downstairs to find her in the library. She had looked up from her book. He had stood in the doorway with the slightly dazed quality of a man returning to himself after an absence. "Miss Cavendish," he said. "You look better," she said. He nodded. He came into the room. He sat down in the chair across from her and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'm told you stayed." "Yes," she said. "You didn't have to." "No," she agreed. He looked at her, really looked, she had thought, the way he almost never looked, directly and with the full weight of his attention, the attention she had seen him give to ledgers and correspondence and estate matters and almost never to people. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, he looked at her. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Cavendish," and picked up the newspaper, and that was all. But that evening, before dinner, she had been crossing the upper hallway when she heard him in the study below, the door slightly open, talking to someone she couldn't identify. And in the middle of the conversation, for no reason she could determine from context, he said, "Vivienne." Just that, her name. In the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, she could not hear the rest, only that word falling out of his mouth as though he had been turning it over and it had simply come loose. She had stopped walking. She had stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she had gone to dress for dinner. She had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself this firmly and repeatedly over the following months, with the discipline of someone who knows that a small fire needs to be put out early or it will not be put out at all. She had not entirely succeeded. That was the honest truth of it. Sitting in the small sitting room 3 years later with her morning tea and the quiet house around her, she admitted it to herself plainly. She had not put it out. She had managed it. She had kept it to the size of something that could be lived with, something that didn't interfere with the practical functioning of her days. But it had been there. A name said once to no one in a hallway on a summer evening. She had built rather a lot on that. Too much, she thought now. Far too much on far too little. She finished her tea. She set the cup down. She looked at the morning light coming through the east window, pale gold and new, the kind of light that belongs entirely to early morning and to no other time of day. She thought about the pause last night. 1 second, 2, 3. She thought about the surname offered in place of the name. She thought about 3 years. And she thought not with anger, not yet, but with the particular clarity of someone who has finally stopped arguing with themselves, that she had 2 choices. She could continue. She could go on being patient and practical and present in rooms where she was not seen, and she could smile at parties and answer correctly and wait for what she was no longer entirely sure, for him to look, for something to change, for the name to come easily the way it should have come years ago, or she could do something. She did not yet know what the something was, but she thought, sitting in the morning light with her empty cup, that it was time to find out. She stood up. She went to her writing desk. She did not write anything yet. She simply sat there with the paper in front of her and the pen in her hand and let herself know, fully and without softening, what she wanted. Not the arrangement, not the title, not the Wiltshire house or the Ashford name or any of the things that had made the match sensible and practical and correct. She wanted to be seen. She wanted her name in his mouth like something he knew. She wanted, God help her, to matter. And if she could not have that, if it was truly not available, if the shelf was always going to be bare when he reached for her, then she needed to know that too. She needed to know it properly, not suspect it from a distance. She set the pen down. She would need to think about how. But the decision, the real decision, the one underneath all the smaller ones, was already made. It had been made, she thought, somewhere around the second of that pause. She had simply needed the third to be certain. The arrangement had made sense. The arrangement had always made sense. What it had never made, what no one had thought to include in the papers signed in rooms she wasn't invited into, was room for her. She intended to make some. The name reached Vivienne on a Tuesday. Not from a friend. She had friends, careful ones, the kind who chose their words with the precision of people who understood that some information was a gift and some was a weapon, and that the difference mattered. None of them told her. It came, instead, from the least likely direction. Her cousin Augusta, who was 22 and well-meaning, and had not yet learned that the most damaging things are not the ones said with malice, but the ones said with the breezy confidence of someone who assumes you already know. They were walking in the park. Augusta was talking about a ball she had attended the previous Thursday. She said several things about the music and several things about a young man who had danced with her twice and whether that meant anything. And then, in the same light conversational tone, she said, "Oh, and I saw your Duke there. He was with the most striking woman, Lady Sophia Reeves. Do you know her? A widow, I think, very gay, very pretty. They were talking for ages in the corner by the windows. I thought it rather—" She stopped, looked at Vivienne, recalibrated visibly and too late. "I'm sure it was nothing." Vivienne looked at the path ahead of them. "I'm sure it was," she said. Augusta said something else. Vivienne answered it. The walk continued. She knew the name. Not well Lady Sophia Reeves existed at the outer edges of the world Vivienne moved through, close enough to be visible and far enough to have remained, until now, simply a shape rather than a person. Young, younger than Vivienne had expected when she thought about it later. 24, perhaps. Widowed at 22 when Lord Reeves had died of something sudden and inconvenient, leaving behind a title that expired with him, a modest house in Kensington, and a wife who was, by all accounts, making the best of things with considerable style. Vivienne went home and thought about her with the same methodical attention she applied to everything that required understanding. She was not, she told herself, jealous. Jealousy required a prior claim of the heart, and Vivienne had been very careful for 3 years not to make that claim. She had the arrangement. She had the papers. She had the Pemberton party and the announcement and the room full of people raising their glasses to something that had her name in it, technically, as a surname. What she did not have was any right to James Ashford's attention, because he had never offered it. You cannot lose what was never given to you. She told herself this. She told herself this several more times over the following days, with decreasing conviction. The second time she heard the name, it was from Mrs. Hartley, who told her at a morning call with the carefully neutral expression of a woman delivering information. She considers her social duty while being very interested in the recipient's reaction. The third time it was from no one. She simply saw them herself. A concert at the Alderton House on a wet Thursday evening in February. The kind of event that fills a room with people who are there for the interval conversations rather than the music, which suited Vivienne because she liked music and found the conversations tedious, and the combination meant she could sit quietly and listen while everyone else filed out at the interval and did what they had actually come for. She stayed in her seat. James was there. She had known he would be. They had been expected to attend together and had arrived together in the correct, formal way of their correct, formal arrangement, and had then separated as they always did, drifting to different parts of the room with the naturalness of two people who had never developed the habit of staying close. At the interval, she watched him from across the room. He was standing near the far windows, the good ones, the ones that looked out over the garden, and he was talking to a woman in a dark blue dress who stood with the particular ease of someone who is entirely comfortable in her own body, which Vivienne had always thought was the rarest and most attractive quality a person could have, and which she herself had spent considerable effort cultivating, and still did not entirely possess. Lady Sophia Reeves was laughing at something James had said. This was notable because Vivienne had heard James say things that were amusing. He had a dry, quiet wit that appeared infrequently and without warning like good weather in November, but she had never in 3 years seen him make someone laugh like that. Openly, easily, with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who is genuinely delighted. She watched his face. He was looking at Lady Sophia Reeves the way he looked at estate ledgers when the numbers came right, with focus, with something that was almost not quite but almost satisfaction. He's present, Vivienne thought. The word arrived with the particular clarity of something she had been circling for a long time without quite landing on. He is present to her. She turned away from the window. She looked at the empty stage, and the empty chairs and the music stands with their waiting pages, and she sat with what she had just seen, the way you sit with something that has confirmed what you already knew and is worse for the confirmation. It was not that James was a cold man. She had understood that for some time in the abstract. The illness in the summer house had shown her something, a version of him that was less managed, less braced, capable of being present to another person in a way his ordinary daily self was not. She had kept that version like a pressed flower, taking it out occasionally to remind herself it existed. But pressed flowers were not gardens. And the man across the room talking to a woman in a dark blue dress was not the man who moved through rooms looking at wallpaper. He was paying attention, just not to her. She went home early. She told James she had a headache, which was sufficiently true that she did not consider it a lie, and she was handed into the carriage and driven home through the wet streets, and she sat in the dark with her hands in her lap, and she let herself feel it, fully, without management, the thing she had been managing for 3 years. It was not jealousy exactly. It was something older and more specific than jealousy. It was the feeling of standing outside a lit window and understanding, with sudden complete certainty, that you have been standing outside for a very long time and that no one inside has noticed you are there. She had been outside. That was the truth of it. She had been outside the whole time, patient and correct and practically dressed for the weather, and James Ashford had been inside looking at the fire, and the distance between them was not 3 feet or 3 years, but something more fundamental. A failure of attention that she had been telling herself was temporary, and that she now understood was not. She cried in the carriage. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic woman. Quietly in the dark, with her face turned toward the window so that the coachman would not hear. The kind of crying that is not grief exactly, but the release of something that has been held attention for too long and has finally, in the privacy of a dark carriage on a wet Thursday night, been allowed to let go. She stopped before the carriage reached the house. She dried her eyes. She straightened her back. She went inside and up to her room and sat at her writing desk and looked at the blank paper for a long time. She did not write anything that night. But she thought clearly, methodically, in the way she thought about things that required action rather than feeling, about what she knew. She knew that James Ashford was not incapable of attention. She had the fever, she had the hallway, she had the 3 seconds across the concert room tonight. She knew that whatever prevented him from giving that attention to her was not a fixed and permanent condition. It was, she searched for the word and found it, a habit. The habit of not looking. The habit of moving through rooms and arrangements and correct, formal evenings without ever quite focusing on the specific. She knew that habits could be broken. She knew also that habits could not be broken by the person who benefited from them. James Ashford would not look up because looking up was comfortable. He would not learn her name by feel Vivienne, the shape of it in his mouth, automatic and sure, because not knowing it cost him nothing. Nothing had cost him anything. That, she thought, was the problem. She picked up the pen. She wrote at the top of the blank page a single question. What would it cost him to lose you? She stared at it. The house was quiet around her. The rain had stopped. Somewhere downstairs a clock chimed 11. What would it cost him, she thought, if I were gone? She did not know the answer. But she thought, setting the pen down, sitting back, looking at the question in her own handwriting, that it was time to find out. Not cruelly, not as a game, but honestly and clearly, and with the full understanding that the answer might be nothing, that it might cost him nothing at all, and that if that was the answer, she needed to know it. She needed to know it so she could decide what to do with the rest of her life, which was hers entirely and only hers, and which she had been holding in suspension for 3 years, waiting for a man to look up from the fire and notice the window. Enough of that, she thought. Enough. She folded the paper. She put it in the drawer. She went to bed. She slept not well, but honestly the sleep of someone who has stopped arguing with themselves and is tired from the effort of it. In the morning she woke early. She dressed without ringing for her maid. She went downstairs. She made tea. And she sat in the east-facing sitting room in the early light, and she thought about a letter. The kind of letter that could not be unsent. The kind that said the thing plainly and without softening and left no room for the comfortable middle distance that James Ashford had been occupying for 3 years. She did not write it yet, but she knew it was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, not here yet but certain. Moving toward her steadily from somewhere just past the horizon, she poured her tea. She waited for the words to find their shape. She had seen him present, she had seen him looking. She had understood, finally and without softening, that the window he wasn't looking at was her. She was done standing in the cold. The only question left was whether to knock or simply to walk away. The letter took her 4 days to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, she had known what to say in the broad outline since the carriage ride home from the concert. The difficulty was not the content. The difficulty was the tone, which had to be exactly right, and which she revised 3 times before she understood why it kept coming out wrong. The first draft was angry. She had not known, until she saw it on the page, how much anger was in her, not the hot, immediate kind that arrives and departs quickly, but the slow, accumulated kind that builds in layers over years of small and unremarked indignities, each one too minor to object to, each one adding its quiet weight to everything beneath it. The first draft said things she meant, but said them in a way that was more about releasing the pressure than about being heard, and she recognized the difference and set it aside. The second draft was too careful. She had overcorrected, pulled back from the anger so thoroughly that the letter became a document, bloodless and precise, the kind of thing a solicitor might write when formally notifying a party of a change in terms. It said the correct things and felt nothing like her. She set that aside too. The third draft was close. The fourth was right. She read it one final time on the morning of the fourth day, sitting at her writing desk in the early light with her tea cooling beside her. It was not long. She had resisted the temptation to make it long, to fill it with evidence and argument and the accumulated weight of 3 years of noticing. James was an intelligent man. He did not need a case made. He needed a truth told, plainly and without theater, in language he could not reframe into something more comfortable. She had written, "I am writing this because I think we have both been polite for long enough. And politeness, in this case, has been a way of not saying things that want saying. I am not writing to accuse you of anything. I am writing because I think you are a man who is capable of more than you currently give, and because I think you don't know that, and because no one has told you, and because I find I cannot continue as we are without saying it. You do not know me. I want to be careful and fair about what I mean by that. I don't mean that you are cruel or indifferent in the way of a man who has decided not to care. I mean something more specific, that in 3 years of being engaged to me, you have not learned the particular shape of who I am. My name is not always the first thing you reach for. I'm not always the thing you see when you look in my direction. I have been, for most of our arrangement, a position more than a person. I am not asking you to love me. I understand that was not part of what was agreed. But I am asking whether you are capable of seeing me, not Miss Cavendish, not the arrangement, me, Vivienne, the person who sat beside you for 3 days when you were ill and read to you and opened the window and learned which side you slept on and did not ask for anything in return and has not, in the time since, stopped hoping that it meant something to you. If it did not, if you are honest with yourself and find that it did not, then I think we should speak plainly about what this arrangement is and what it is not. I would rather know the truth than continue performing a future I am not certain we are both committed to. I am not asking you to respond immediately. I am asking you to respond honestly. That is all I have ever wanted from you. Vivienne, she folded it. She sealed it. She held it in her hands for a moment, this small, dense, irreversible thing, and she thought about the 4th day of the fever, and the hallway and the pause at the party, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and she thought, I have been waiting long enough. She rang for her maid. Please have this delivered to Ashford House, she said, this morning. Yes, miss. The maid took it and left. Vivienne sat for a moment in the quiet room. Then she stood up, straightened her back, and went to get dressed. She had not felt, she realized, this light in years. The waiting was harder than the writing. She had expected this and had prepared for it in the way she prepared for difficult things, by filling the time with activity precise enough to require attention. She answered her correspondence. She visited her aunt on Wednesday. She went to the lending library and chose 3 books with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who intends to read and not merely to hold. She walked in the park on Thursday morning and did not think about whether a reply had arrived, which meant she thought about it constantly, which was the inevitable consequence of telling yourself not to think about something. Her mother noticed, because her mother always noticed, and said nothing, because her mother had long since understood that saying something to Vivienne before Vivienne was ready to hear it was a waste of both their time. She simply appeared on Thursday afternoon with an extra cup and a plate of biscuits and sat down in the east-facing sitting room and read her own correspondence while Vivienne read her book, and neither of them said anything, and it was, Vivienne thought, one of the more comforting hours she had spent in recent memory. Friday passed. Saturday passed. Sunday morning Vivienne woke early and lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, he is not going to reply. The shelf was bare. She had suspected it. Now she would know. She would take the knowledge and do something with it. She would go to her father. She would be practical and direct, and she would find a way through because she always found a way through because that was what she did. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs. He was in the entrance hall. She did not know this, could not have known. The letter had gone to Ashford House, and she had received nothing in return, and there had been no note, no message, no indication that anything had been received, let alone considered. And so she came around the corner from the staircase and stopped. James Ashford was standing in her entrance hall. Not sitting, standing, which meant he had been shown in and had declined the chair, the way a man does when he is not planning to stay long or when he is too unsettled to sit. His coat was on. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at the floor when she appeared, and he looked up when he heard her step, and they stood in the entrance hall on a Sunday morning and looked at each other. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept particularly well. She thought, good. Not cruelly, but honestly. Good because it meant the letter had arrived somewhere, had cost something, had not simply been filed and managed and absorbed without trace the way she sometimes feared everything she offered him was absorbed. The sleeplessness was evidence. She filed it carefully. James, she said. Vivienne, he said, her name first. Immediately, without reaching for it, she noticed. She said nothing about it, but she noticed. They went into the morning room because the entrance hall was not a place for conversations of this kind, and because the morning room was at the back of the house and unlikely to be disturbed, and because Vivienne needed somewhere to put herself that was not a doorway. She sat down. He did not immediately. He stood near the window, of course he did, near the window, looking out at the garden that was still winter-bare and gray, and she watched him from her chair and waited. He was working towards something. She could see it, the particular quality of stillness in him that she had learned over 3 years of watching, meant internal assembly. He was putting words together. He was a man who said things carefully or did not say them at all, and she had learned not to rush him, and she sat with her hands in her lap and the morning light coming through the window, and she waited. I read your letter, he said. I assumed, she said. I read it, he stopped, tried again, more than once. All right, she said. He turned from the window then, faced her properly, with the full weight of the attention she had watched him give to Ledgers and Lady Sophia Reeves, and almost never to her. It landed differently than she had expected. Heavier, somehow, more real. You were right, he said, about the name. She said nothing. At the party, Pemberton's nephew. He said it as though he had been turning the specific moment over and over, examining it from every angle, finding it consistently damning. There was a moment where I couldn't, he stopped. That should not have happened. It was, he looked for the word and chose it with visible care. Inexcusable. Yes, Vivienne said, it was. He looked at her, a flash of something, not offense, more like recognition. She suspected no one agreed with him that directly very often. You were also right, he said, about the 3 days in Wiltshire. She went very still. I didn't thank you properly, he said. I said the words I said thank you, but I didn't. He paused. I have thought about those 3 days more than I have indicated. More than I have indicated to anyone, including myself, until I read your letter. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird made a brief, decisive sound and then stopped. I think, he said slowly, that I am not good at people. I know, Vivienne said. I am good at things, at systems, at problems with identifiable solutions. He looked at the window again just briefly as though he needed the relief of a fixed point. People are less fixed. They require a different kind of attention, and I have not practiced it. I have not, I think, been encouraged to practice it. And I have let that. He stopped. I have let it mean that the people nearest to me have had less from me than they deserved. Vivienne looked at him. She thought about the letter she had written. She thought about the tone she had tried for the 4th draft, the right one, honest and clear and without the pressure of accumulated anger, just the plain truth of what was and what she needed. She thought about how afraid she had been, sealing it, that it would arrive in a man who was not capable of receiving it. She thought, he is receiving it. She thought, he is doing it badly and slowly and with visible discomfort, but he is receiving it. What do you want? She said. He looked at her. From this conversation, she said, from all of it, what do you actually want, James? The question landed in the room the way the letter had landed, she imagined, when he first read it, with the particular weight of something that does not permit a comfortable middle answer. He could not say, I want the arrangement to continue, because she had foreclosed that. He could not say, I want things to change, without being specific about what that meant and whether he meant it. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she began, quietly and without drama, to prepare herself for the shelf, for the bare space, for the answer that was nothing, that it cost him nothing, that she needed to know that, and now she would. Then he said, I want to try. She looked at him. I don't know if I'm capable of. He stopped, started again. I can't promise you what I don't know I can give. I think that would be another form of the same dishonesty we've been living with. He paused. But I want to try to see you, properly, the way you deserve to be seen. That's not very much, Vivienne said. No, he agreed, it isn't. It is also, she said carefully, more than you have offered me in 3 years. He absorbed this. Yes, he said, it is. Vivienne looked at the winter garden through the window, bare trees, gray sky, the specific blankness of a season that has not yet decided to become anything else. She thought about walking away. She thought about it honestly, allowed the option its full weight, turned it over, felt the reality of it. She could end this. She could go to her father, invoke the third question she had asked at 17, do I have recourse, and find out whether the answer had changed. She could take the knowledge that it had cost him something and leave it there, proof enough that she had existed, and go. Part of her wanted to. The part that had stood in the alcove at the party and thought enough. The part that had sat in the concert room and watched him be present to someone who was not her. But there was another part, smaller, more honest, less injured, that was watching him stand at the window with his hat in his hands, having come on a Sunday morning without announcement to say, I read your letter more than once and I want to try. She thought about pressed flowers. She thought about the difference between pressed flowers and gardens. She thought, a garden has to start somewhere. I have conditions, she said. Something shifted in him, not relaxation exactly, but a loosening of the particular tension of a man waiting for a verdict. Tell me, he said. You will learn my name, she said. Not as a fact, as a habit. It will be the first thing, not the last. Yes, he said. You will tell me things. Not everything. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not, but things that matter. When something is difficult, when something changes, when something concerns the life we are supposed to be building together. You will tell me rather than manage it alone and present me with outcomes. He was quiet for a moment. That will be harder, he said. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. All right, he said. And Lady Sophia Reeves is a woman I found easy to talk to, he said before she could finish, because she required nothing of me, because nothing was at stake. He paused. I understand, having read your letter, that this is not a recommendation. Vivienne looked at him. No, she said, it isn't. It's over, he said simply. There was nothing, it was not what it may have appeared, but it's over regardless, because it was, he searched for the word, a rehearsal, for something I should have been doing here. The room was very quiet. Vivienne sat with everything he had said, laid it out, examined it, tested the weight of it the way you test ice before you step onto it. She thought, he could be performing this. She thought, he is not performing this. He is too bad at it for it to be a performance. She thought, that is possibly the most reassuring thing about him. I'm not forgiving you today, she said. He nodded once. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying that I will watch, that I am willing to see whether try becomes something more than a word. She met his eyes. But I will not wait 3 more years, James. I will not be patient with no return. If nothing changes, if 6 months from now you are still looking at rooms, I will end this, and I will find a way to do it regardless of what the papers say, and I will not feel guilty about it. Understood, he said. Good, she said. She stood up. He stood up, straightening, putting his hat back in his hands with the reflexive instinct of a man about to leave. James, she said. He looked at her. Say my name again, she said. Just say it so I know you know it. Something moved across his face, not embarrassment, exactly. Something more private than embarrassment. The expression of a man being asked to do something small that is actually very large. He looked at her directly. Vivienne, he said. Her name, steady and clear and entirely intentional. Not to no one in a hallway, not stumbled toward in a pause, to her, looking at her. She held it for a moment. Thank you, she said. You may go, he went. She stood in the morning room after he had gone and listened to the front door close and his steps on the street, and then the silence that came after. She was shaking slightly. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, with the detached accuracy of someone cataloging the state of their own body. Not fear, not grief. Something more like the physical consequence of sustained intensity, the way your hands shake after you have been holding something heavy for a long time and finally set it down. She had set it down. She did not know yet what would grow in the space where it had been, but she had set it down. She went to the window. The garden was still bare and gray and entirely noncommittal about spring. A garden has to start somewhere, she thought. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. She stood there for a while. He had come. He had said her name. She had not forgiven him. But she had left the door open, just slightly, just enough, because she was honest enough to know that she wanted to. The question now was whether he would learn to knock. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Vivienne had half expected drama, had braced for it, in the way you brace for weather after a storm warning, scanning the horizon for the next thing. But the next thing, it turned out, was not dramatic at all. It was quiet. It was small. It was the specific, undramatic work of two people who have agreed to try something without being certain it will work, moving carefully in the new space between them like people learning the dimensions of a room in the dark. James did not transform. She had not expected him to. Transformation was for novels, and Vivienne had read enough novels to know that the most dishonest thing about them was not the coincidences or the convenient inheritances but the speed. The way a man who had been one thing for 40 years became another thing in the space of a chapter, as though the self were a coat that could be exchanged at will. Real change was slower and less visible and frequently indistinguishable, from the outside, from no change at all. But she had said she would watch, so she watched. The first thing she noticed was the name. He had said he would learn it as a habit, not a fact, and she had filed that as a promise she would hold him to without reminding him of it. The reminding would ruin it, would make it performance rather than change, and performance was the last thing she wanted from him. She wanted the real thing or nothing. The real thing, it turned out, was imperfect and therefore convincing. He did not always say it first. There were moments at a dinner in the third week when they were introduced to a couple he hadn't met before, when she watched him open his mouth and saw the familiar pause, the reaching, and felt the familiar brace of herself. And then he said, "My fiancée, Vivienne." Not her surname, not Miss Cavendish, not a hesitation filled with the wrong thing, her name. He had looked slightly surprised at himself, she thought, as though the habit had arrived before he'd consciously summoned it and had caught him off guard. She had looked away before he could see her face, because what was on her face in that moment was not something she was ready to show him. She told no one. She took it out occasionally in private and looked at it the way she had looked at the pressed flower. The name said once in a hallway, but this time with the difference of a woman who is trying very hard not to build too much on too little, and who is finding it, despite her best efforts, rather difficult. The second thing she noticed was harder to name. He began, and she used the word carefully, because it was not a sudden shift but a gradual one, the way light changes in a room as the season turns. So slowly you cannot identify the moment it became different. He began to tell her things. Not everything. She had not asked for everything and she did not want it. She was not interested in the full architecture of his interior life, which she suspected was considerable, and which she thought he needed to keep some portion of for himself. She had asked for things that mattered, things that concerned the life they were building. The first time it was small. They were walking in the park on a Tuesday. They had begun walking together on Tuesdays, without discussing it, which had happened because he had appeared at her door one Tuesday with his hat on and said, "Will you walk?" And she had said yes. And the following Tuesday the same thing had occurred. And by the third Tuesday it was simply what Tuesdays were, and he said, without preamble, that his solicitor had identified a problem with the estate's northern holdings that was going to require a decision he was not certain he was making correctly. Vivienne listened. She did not offer an opinion he hadn't asked for. She asked two questions, practical, specific, the kind that helped her understand the shape of the problem rather than the solution. And he answered them, and she could see, as he answered, that the answering itself was useful to him. That he was a man who had been thinking alone for so long that the presence of another mind, asking different questions, shifted something. "What do you think?" he said finally. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's yes," he said. "That's what I've been arriving at and couldn't quite." He stopped. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. They walked on. She did not make anything of it, but she thought on the way home that this was what she had meant, not the grand gesture, not the transformation. This, two people walking on a Tuesday, one of them telling the other something real, the other listening and being useful and being thanked. This was what she had been asking for. It was very small. It was not nothing. The third thing she noticed because of James's mother. The Duchess of Ashford had always been, in Vivienne's experience, a woman who operated on a frequency slightly beyond the range of ordinary conversation. Present, watchful, registering everything and revealing almost nothing, with the self-contained authority of someone who has been the most important person in every room she entered for 50 years and no longer needs to announce it. She had approved of Vivienne from the beginning, the "you'll do" at the end of the first evening, and Vivienne had filed this as a significant data point while being careful not to attach too much to it. The Duchess approved of Vivienne. The Duchess was not James, but in the 5th week, the Duchess came to call. Alone, without the usual apparatus of morning calls, without the social architecture of an occasion. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and was shown into the drawing room and sat down and accepted tea, and looked at Vivienne with her bright, undeceivable eyes and said, "He told me he came to see you, in January." "Yes," Vivienne said. "He told me what you wrote him." She paused. "He didn't tell me the contents. He told me that you had said something that wanted saying and that he had been affected by it." Vivienne said nothing. She was not sure what the correct response was, and in the absence of certainty she had learned to say nothing and let the other person continue. The Duchess looked at her tea, then at Vivienne. "I want to tell you something," she said, "that I should perhaps have told you earlier, and that I am telling you now because I think it is relevant, and because I think you are the kind of person who prefers information to its absence." "I am," Vivienne said. "James was not always like this," the Duchess said. "The distance, the looking at rooms, he was not always this way." She paused. "His father was a difficult man, not cruel, I want to be precise about that, not cruel, but distant in the way that some men are distant, as though the people nearest to them are also somehow the hardest to see. James grew up with that. He learned it the way children learn the things around them, not as a lesson but as a condition, as the way things simply are." Vivienne was very still. "I did not correct it," the Duchess said. There was something in her voice, not quite regret but close. The voice of a woman who has made her peace with something that still costs her occasionally. "I was managing my own version of the same distance, I think. I told myself he would find his way, that the right person would." She stopped. "I told myself various things." "And now," Vivienne said quietly. The Duchess looked at her with the full, direct attention of her extraordinary eyes. "And now," she said, "I have watched him read a letter 4 times. I have watched him leave this house on a Sunday morning without his secretary or his schedule or any of the usual preparations he makes before doing anything uncomfortable. I have watched him come back and say, when I asked him how it went, that he had been—" She paused. "He said he had been honest, as though it had surprised him." Vivienne looked at her hands. "He is trying," the Duchess said. "I want you to know that what you are seeing is not performance. He doesn't know how to perform, he never learned that either, which is its own problem. What you are seeing is a man doing something genuinely difficult." She set down her cup. "I am not asking you to make it easier for him. I don't think that would help either of you. I am simply telling you, so that you know what you are looking at." The room was quiet. Vivienne thought about the park on Tuesdays, and the name said first at the dinner, and the slightly surprised quality of a man whose habit had arrived before he did. "Thank you," she said. The Duchess nodded once, the brief, compressed nod of a woman who has said what she came to say and considers the matter addressed. She finished her tea. She left. That evening, Vivienne sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. She thought about what the Duchess had said. She thought about distance as a condition, as a thing learned so early it becomes invisible, indistinguishable from character. She thought about her own conditions, the things she had asked for, the 6 months she had given, the door left open just slightly. She thought about whether she was being careful or whether she was being afraid. There was a difference. Careful was, I am watching, I am paying attention, I am not giving more than I have evidence to give. Afraid was, I have evidence and I am choosing not to trust it because trust is the most dangerous thing I know how to do, and I have been standing outside for 3 years and I am not ready to step inside. She sat with this for a while. She thought about the fever and the hallway and the name said to no one. She thought about Vivienne said to her on a Sunday morning directly and with intention. She thought about a man reading her letter 4 times, going home, coming back. She picked up the pen. She did not write to James. Instead, she wrote in her journal, the one she had kept since she was 12, precise and unsentimental, a single question, underneath the one she had written before. What would it cost you to trust him? She stared at it. The honest answer, the one she had been not answering for several weeks, was everything. It would cost everything. Because I have never trusted anyone with the whole of it, and I don't know if I can, and I don't know if he will hold it, and I don't know if. She stopped writing. She looked at the sentence. She thought about the Duchess's voice. A man doing something genuinely difficult. She thought about how difficult was not the same as certain, how trying was not the same as succeeding, how the door left open was not the same as walking through. But she also thought, and this was the thought she had been holding at bay most carefully, the one she had been most afraid to let herself have because it was the most vulnerable and therefore the most dangerous, she thought. I want him to hold it. Not because of the arrangement, not because of the papers or the name or the Ashford estate, because of Tuesday walks and a letter read 4 times and a man who came on a Sunday without his secretary and said I want to try, as though it cost him something real, because she had been watching and what she had seen was not nothing. She closed the journal. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the difference between careful and afraid, and she was not sure she had answered the question, and she was not sure she would answer it tonight. But she thought just before sleep that the fact she was asking it was itself an answer. Of some kind. She wasn't sure yet of what kind. The letter from the Duchess arrived 2 weeks later. Not about James, a different letter, brief and direct, the Duchess's handwriting like her speech. Clear, unornamented, immediately legible. I am visiting a friend in Bath next month and intend to travel through London on my return. I would like to call on you if you are agreeable. There is something I have been considering saying for some time, and I believe it is now the appropriate moment to say it. I hope you are well. I believe you are. You strike me as a woman who generally is. Vivienne read it twice. Then she wrote back, I am agreeable. I will be here. She sealed the note and gave it to the maid and went back to what she had been doing. But she thought, for the rest of the day, about what the appropriate moment might have arrived for. She thought about it with the particular alertness of someone who has learned that the Duchess of Ashford does not say things without reason, and that when she does say them, they are generally worth hearing. She waited. The Duchess came on a Thursday. She came in from the rain. It had been raining for 3 days. The particular grey London rain that seems less like weather and more like the city's natural condition. And she took off her wet coat and accepted tea, and looked at Vivienne across the drawing room with the expression of a woman who has organized herself for something. "I want to tell you," she said, "about the morning after you sent your letter." Vivienne set down her cup. "I was there when it arrived," the Duchess said. "I was staying at Ashford House. I stay there occasionally when I am in London. It is still my house in the relevant ways. I was at breakfast. James came in with the letter. He had already opened it, which he does not usually do over breakfast. He usually waits until he is in the study. He sat down. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. He picked it up. He read it a third time." She paused. "I said nothing. I watched him read it a fourth time. Then he put it in his pocket and looked out the window for quite a long time. And then he said, to no one in particular." She stopped. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not emotional, the Duchess was not an emotional woman, but something in it had changed register, the way a piece of music changes key. He said, "Vivienne." Vivienne's breath stopped. "Just that," the Duchess said. "Your name, out loud, as though he was practicing it or checking that he knew it, or," she paused. "I don't know exactly what he was doing, but he said it. And then he stood up and went to get his coat." The room was very quiet. "I'm telling you this," the Duchess said, "because I think you should know that before he came to you that Sunday, before he had prepared anything or decided anything, the first thing he did was say your name." She looked at Vivienne directly. "The first thing, when there was no one to perform it for." Vivienne looked at the window. The rain was still coming down outside, gray and steady and entirely indifferent. She thought about a hallway, a summer evening, a name said to no one. She thought about a drawing room on a Sunday morning, and I want to try, and the slightly surprised quality of a man whose habit had arrived before he had. She thought about the difference between a pressed flower and a garden. She thought, the garden has already started. She thought, I have been watching it start and telling myself I wasn't sure. She looked at the Duchess. "He said my name," she said. "Before anything else," the Duchess said. "Yes." Vivienne sat with that for the rest of the day. That evening she did not write in her journal. She did not write to James. She sat in the east-facing sitting room in the evening light. It was clearing outside, the rain giving way to a thin gold at the edge of the sky, and she thought about the question she had written. What would it cost you to trust him? She thought about the answer she had been not answering. And then quietly and without drama, without theater, in the private way she did everything that mattered, she let herself answer it. Everything, she thought. It would cost everything. She paused. Yes, she thought, and the end took a while, but it came, and I think I'm ready. She had watched. She had been careful. She had been, for a little while, afraid. Now she knew what the next thing was, and she was, for the first time in 3 years, not afraid of knowing. She did not write to him immediately. This was deliberate, not cruelty, not the playing of games she had always found tedious and beneath her, but the considered decision of a woman who had spent 3 years acting before she was ready and had learned, at some cost, what that produced. She was ready now. She knew she was ready. But ready was not the same as rushed, and she wanted to come to this, whatever this was going to be, from stillness rather than momentum. She gave herself 3 days. She used them well. She walked on Tuesday alone, the usual park route, and let herself think without directing the thinking. Let it move where it wanted, which turned out to be less frightening than she had expected. She had been managing her thoughts about James Ashford for so long, keeping them within careful borders, that the experience of simply letting them go where they went felt almost illicit. Like opening a door she had been leaning against for years and finding the room on the other side smaller than the door had implied. Not smaller in a disappointing way, smaller in the way of things that are real rather than imagined, specific, handleable. She walked and thought and arrived home with mud on her boots and a clarity she had not had in years. On Wednesday she had lunch with her mother, who asked no questions and listened to everything, which was her mother's particular genius. On Thursday morning she sat at her writing desk with the early light coming through the east window, and she wrote. Not a letter this time. 1 line. Sunday, 4 o'clock. Bring nothing. Just come. She folded it. She sealed it. She gave it to the maid. Then she went to find something to do for 3 more days. She did not tell anyone. Not her mother, not Augusta, not the small circle of careful friends who had watched the situation with the quiet attentiveness of people who care and know better than to say so. She held it to herself, this thing that was still becoming, that did not yet have a name she was comfortable using, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that holding it was not difficult. It did not press against her the way uncertainty had pressed, the way the 3-year waiting had pressed. It sat quietly. It was patient, which she recognized, a little wryly, as a quality she had always associated with herself and not with anything she felt about James Ashford. Perhaps, she thought, that was changing. Perhaps she was allowing it to. Sunday arrived the way Sundays do, gradually, without fanfare, with the particular quality of a day that belongs to itself rather than to the week around it. She was dressed by 3:30. Not elaborately, she had thought about this, the temptation to armor herself in the right dress, the right arrangement, the careful presentation of a woman who has prepared. She had decided against it. She wore the dark green wool she wore when she was not performing anything, the dress her mother called sensible and her cousin Augusta called charming in a quiet way, and that Vivienne simply thought of as herself. She did her hair without her maid. She put on her mother's pearl earrings because they were her mother's, and she wanted today something that was simply hers. She went downstairs at 4:15. She did not sit down. She stood near the window of the morning room and watched the street and thought about nothing in particular, which she was getting better at. At 4 o'clock exactly, which told her something because James Ashford was a punctual man, punctuality being one of the forms of control available to people who find other forms more difficult, she heard the knock. She heard the footman answer it. She heard footsteps in the hall. She turned from the window. He came in without announcement. Or rather, the footman announced him, but Vivienne had already turned, and the announcement was therefore somewhat redundant. A fact the footman seemed to understand because he withdrew very quickly and closed the door behind him with the discretion of someone who has read the room accurately. James was in the doorway. No hat this time, he was holding it when he arrived. She would find out later from the footman, but had left it in the hall, which was different from the Sunday in January when he had kept it in his hands the entire time. She noticed this. She noticed everything still in the way she had always noticed everything, but the noticing felt different today, less like cataloging evidence and more like simply paying attention to a person she wanted to know. He looked better than January. Not dramatically, he was not a man who changed dramatically, but the sleeplessness was gone, and in its place was something she had seen occasionally in glimpses over the past weeks, a quality of presence, of being where he was rather than slightly to the left of it, braced for something that had not yet arrived. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You came," she said. "You asked me to," he said. "I know," she paused. "I wasn't certain you would." He was quiet for a moment. "I was," he said. "As soon as the note arrived, I was certain." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. That was new. She looked at him. "Being certain," he said, "about something that wasn't a column of figures or a decision with identifiable correct outcomes." He paused. "You asked me to come. I knew immediately that I would come. I didn't have to think about it." He looked slightly surprised at himself as he said it, the way he had looked surprised when the habit arrived before he did. "That was new," he said again, more quietly. Vivienne felt something shift in her chest, that warmth again, the persistent, embarrassing warmth, except today she did not tell herself to stop. Today she let it be what it was and stand where it stood. "Sit down," she said, "please." They sat. Not across the room from each other. She had thought about this too, the arrangement of the chairs, which was the kind of thing she thought about and which she had decided should be close enough for a real conversation, and far enough that neither of them felt cornered. She had chosen the 2 chairs near the window, angled slightly toward each other, with the pale March light coming through the glass and the street beyond quiet on a Sunday afternoon. He sat with his usual straightness, the particular posture of a man who has carried authority long enough that it has become physical, but without the braced quality she had spent 3 years cataloging. He was present. She could feel it across the small distance between them, the specific weight of his attention directed at her. She had wanted this. She had been wanting this. She allowed herself to know it fully today without the careful management for a very long time. I want to tell you something, she said. Before anything else, I want to tell you what I decided, and then I want to hear what you have to say, and then, she paused. And then we'll see. All right, he said. I've been watching, she said, the past weeks, Tuesdays and dinners and the telling me things. I've been watching, and I have been deliberately not deciding what I thought about it, giving it time, giving you time. She looked at her hands for a moment. Your mother came to see me. He went still. What did she say? She told me about the morning the letter arrived. Vivienne looked up. She told me what you did before you came here. In January, he was very still. You said my name, Vivienne said. The words landed in the room quietly. She watched his face and she saw it, the slight flinch of a man who has been seen doing something private, something he had not offered for observation. Not embarrassment exactly, something more exposed than embarrassment, something that had no armor around it. She had no right to tell you that, he said. No, Vivienne agreed. She did it anyway. A pause. It was, he stopped. I was not aware I was going to do it. It was not planned. I know, she said. That's why it mattered. He looked at her. The full weight look, the ledger look, the estate problem look, the look she had watched him give to everything that required his genuine attention, and that he had given her in her entire experience of him, a handful of times she could count on one hand. He was giving it to her now. I have thought about you, he said, considerably more than I have shown. I want you to know that. I want you to know that the absence, the distance you wrote to me about was not indifference. It was, he paused. I don't have a word for what it was that isn't an excuse, and I don't want to offer you excuses. Then don't, she said. Then I'll say only this. He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, the movement of a man having a careful distance. I know your name. I know that you read in the morning before the house wakes. I know that you ask practical questions when other people ask polite ones. I know that you stayed for 3 days when you didn't have to and asked for nothing in return, and that I thanked you incorrectly and have thought about that incorrectly thanking more times than I can account for. He paused. I know that you are the only person who has ever written to me without calculating what the letter would cost them. And I know that I did not deserve that letter, and that you sent it anyway, and that it was. He stopped. He looked at her. It was the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, he said, in my entire life, and I am 41 years old. The room was very quiet. Outside the street was Sunday still. Somewhere distant a church bell finished something it had started. Vivienne looked at this man. She thought about outside windows and lit rooms and 3 years of standing in the cold. She thought, the door is open. She thought, I opened it. She thought, he is standing in it and he is not performing, and he is 41 years old and no one has ever been honest with him, and I wrote him a letter, and he said my name to no one in a room by himself before he had decided anything. She thought, I am going to step inside now. I have conditions, she said, still, the same ones, and I mean them, and they don't change. I know, he said, I don't want them to change. And I am not, she paused. I am not going to pretend that the past 3 years didn't happen. I am not going to perform forgiveness I haven't fully arrived at yet. That would be dishonest, and I think we have agreed that dishonesty is the thing we are moving away from. Yes, he said. But I am also not, she said more quietly, going to pretend that I don't. She stopped, found the word, used it, which cost her something which she thought was probably the right amount. That I don't care about you, because I do. I have for some time in spite of my better efforts, and I think you should know that, because you told me things I didn't have to know, and I think fairness requires the same. He was very still. Vivienne, he said her name immediately first. Yes, she said. I care about you, he said. I have been, he stopped, started again in the careful way of a man who is choosing honesty over fluency. I have been caring about you badly, incorrectly, in the way of a person who feels something and has no idea what to do with it and therefore does nothing and calls the nothing management. He paused. I would like to try caring about you better, if you will let me continue trying. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with his straight back and his full attention, and his 41 years of looking at rooms, and his 4 times reading a letter, and his name said to no one, and his slightly surprised habit. "I'll let you continue," she said. He did not reach for her hand. She noticed this and thought about it afterward, the way he didn't. Another man might have in that moment. Another man might have crossed the small distance between the chairs with the momentum of the conversation and taken her hand in the manner of a romantic resolution, a seal on something agreed. James did not. He sat back slightly, instead, the movement of a man who has received something and is being careful with it, the way you are careful with things that matter and can be broken. He looked at her with the full weight attention and he said, "I would like to walk on Tuesday, if that suits you." Vivienne felt something in her chest, the warmth again, but quieter now, more settled. Less like a fire catching and more like a fire that has been burning long enough to be reliable. "It suits me," she said. "Good," he said. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table beside his chair. The hat he had left in the hall in January, collected on the way in today, which was itself a small and probably unconscious thing that she filed without comment. He stood. She stood. They were standing in the morning room on a Sunday afternoon, with the pale March light going golden at the edges and the street outside beginning, slowly, to think about evening. And they were standing close enough that she could see the exact quality of his attention. Still here, still fully here, not retreating into the managed distance. "Vivienne," he said. "You keep saying my name," she said. "I know," he paused. "I find I want to. I'm not certain it's always necessary." "No," she said, "it isn't." "But he stopped, the almost smile again, the one that arrived slightly surprised at itself. "I spent a long time not saying it. I think I'm making up for it," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "something like that. He left at 5:30. She walked him to the door, not the footman herself, which she did not usually do and which felt correct today without requiring explanation. And he said goodbye in the correct, formal way that was the only way he knew, and she said goodbye in return, and he went down the steps and into the early evening street. She stood in the doorway. She watched him walk away. She watched the specific way he walked, the straightness, the purpose, the slight asymmetry in his gait she had noticed months ago and had always found, she admitted to herself now, inexplicably endearing. She watched until he turned the corner. Then she went back inside. She closed the door. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment in the quiet house. She was smiling. Not the composed, careful smile, not the party smile, not the smile she wore when someone said something pleasant that required acknowledgement. The other one, the private one, the one that arrived without permission when she was alone and something had happened that she had not entirely expected. The kind that meant something had changed. She let it stay. It had earned its place. That evening she opened her journal to the page with the 2 questions. What would it cost him to lose you? What would it cost you to trust him? She read them both. Then she turned to a new page. She wrote not an answer to either question but something else, something that was not a question at all. Tuesday, she wrote, 4 miles. He will be on time. He will say my name at least once unnecessarily. I will let him. She looked at it. She added below it, very small, I think this is going to be all right. Then she closed the journal. She went to bed. She slept well, properly, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has stopped waiting for something and started living toward it. And in the morning she woke early and went downstairs and made tea and sat in the east light and thought about Tuesday. She had let him in. Not all the way, not yet, not immediately, not in the careless way of someone who has forgotten what standing outside costs, but in. Enough. The rest was Tuesday and Wednesday and all the days after that. Tuesday came with actual spring in it. Not the tentative, provisional spring of March, the apologetic kind that arrives and then retreats, offering pale sun, and then taking it back as though it had made a promise it wasn't sure it could keep. This was April spring, decided and committed, the kind that smells of earth and open things and makes the city feel briefly, improbably possible. The trees along the park path had come out overnight in that way they had, holding back and then all at once, as though they had been waiting for a consensus, and it had finally been reached. Vivienne noticed all of this on the walk from her door to the park gate. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, with the full attention she gave the world when she was not deploying it on a specific problem. She had been, she realized, deploying it on specific problems for a very long time. The past weeks had given her something back. The noticing that was just noticing, not cataloging. The looking that was just looking, not assessing. She thought this was probably what people meant when they talked about being happy, though she was cautious about the word and preferred not to use it until she was certain it applied. She was getting more certain. James was at the gate at 10 o'clock exactly. He was always at the gate at 10 o'clock exactly on Tuesdays, which she had come to find privately, deeply, and entirely unexpectedly comforting. There was something about the punctuality, the simple, reliable fact of him being where he said he would be when he said he would be there, that she had not anticipated would matter to her as much as it did. She had spent 3 years managing the absence of exactly this. The presence of it, she was discovering, had a weight she felt in her chest each Tuesday morning before she left the house. She did not tell him this. She thought today she might. They began the usual route, East Gate, the long path along the water, the bench at the halfway point where they sometimes stopped, and sometimes didn't depending on the weather and the conversation, the return through the avenue of chestnuts that were, today, absolutely determined to be magnificent. They walked for a few minutes in the easy quiet they had developed, the kind of silence that is not the absence of conversation, but the presence of two people comfortable enough to be somewhere together without filling it. She had not known, before this, that silence with James Ashford could feel like that. She had known silence with him as distance. This was different. This was the same silence but with the distance removed, and the difference was so complete that she sometimes thought about it afterward, the same way she had thought about the name. "The accounts are resolved," he said after a while. She glanced at him. "The Northern Holdings." "Yes, the decision we discussed, the route I had been arriving at turned out to be correct." He paused. "Your question, the second one, about the tenant agreements, I had been not looking at that part. Once I looked at it, the rest followed." "Good," she said. "It was your question," he said. "It was your decision," she said. "I asked a question, that's a different thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You are very careful," he said, "about not taking credit for things." "I'm careful about accuracy," she said. "There's a difference." "You sound like me," he said. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." He looked at her then, the sideways look, the one that arrived when something had surprised him, and she felt it land the way his attention always landed now, with the warmth she had stopped arguing with. "Vivienne," he said. "That one was unnecessary," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He paused. "I find I don't mind." She looked at the path ahead. The chestnuts were doing their absolute best. The water to their left caught the morning light in long, flat pieces. Somewhere behind them a child was shouting something joyful at a dog. She thought, "This is what I wanted." She thought, "I am in it." She thought, "Say the thing." She said it at the bench. They had stopped, the weather warranted it, the light warranted it. The fact that they were both people who tended to say difficult things better when they were not moving warranted it. She sat. He sat beside her, not at the far end in the formal way of the early weeks, but at the near end, the distance between them, the distance of two people who have stopped measuring it. She looked at the water. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly because we have agreed that plainness is what we are doing now, and because I think anything less than plain would not do it justice." He was still beside her. "All right," he said. "I told you in January that I cared about you." She paused. "I was accurate, but I was not complete. I was careful about how much I said because I didn't know yet how much was safe to say. I think I know now." She turned to look at him. "I love you. I have been arriving at it, I think, for a long time." Not despite the past 3 years, but in some complicated way because of them. Because I know what it cost to write that letter, and what it cost you to come on a Sunday, and what it has cost both of us to do this badly and try to do it better. I love the version of you I have seen in the past months, and I want to keep seeing it. And I want you to know that I am not saying it as a condition or a claim or a thing that requires a particular response. I am saying it because it is true and because we said we were being honest, and this is the honest thing. She looked back at the water. Her heart was going rather faster than she would have preferred. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she began, despite herself, to run the inventory of possible responses, not anxiously but with the practical reflex of a woman who has learned to prepare for outcomes. She thought, he will say he cares about me, which I already know. She thought, he will say something careful about the arrangement and the future, which will be correct and somewhat insufficient. She thought, he will. I have been in love with you, he said, since the summer in Wiltshire. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the water, the way she had been looking at the water, as though the fixed point helped with what was being said. Not immediately, he said. Not the first day, not the fever. After. When I came downstairs and you were in the library and you looked up and said you look better, with the specific tone of a woman who has been managing everything for 3 days and is relieved it is over and has no intention of making anything of it. He paused. I went back to my study and sat down and understood that I had missed something very important and had no idea what to do about it. Vivienne looked at his profile. You said nothing, she said. I didn't know how. He turned to look at her then, the full weight look, all of it, nothing held back. I have spent my entire adult life being competent at things that can be managed. You cannot be managed. I tried briefly to maintain the correct distance and treat the whole thing as something that would resolve itself with time. It didn't resolve. It accumulated. Something moved across his face. When you walked into the party in January and stood 3 feet from me and I couldn't find your name, I knew. Standing there with Pemberton's nephew looking at me, I knew exactly what I had done. He stopped. I knew exactly what I had been doing for 3 years, to you, and I couldn't, he paused. I couldn't correct it in that moment. I didn't know how to correct it in that moment. And I have thought about those 3 seconds every day since. 1 second, 2, 3, Vivienne said quietly. Yes, he said, every day. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had been in love with her since a library in Wiltshire, and had carried it for 3 years in the particular way of someone who has no practice with the thing they are carrying, badly, silently, incorrectly, at considerable cost to both of them, and had then received a letter and gone home and said her name to no one and come back on a Sunday without his secretary and tried. She thought, we have wasted a great deal of time. She thought, we have not wasted all of it. She thought, the garden started earlier than I knew. She reached over and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a gesture designed to mean something. Simply, her hand over his on the bench in the April morning, with the chestnuts being magnificent and the water doing its flat, bright thing with the light. He turned his hand over beneath hers. He held on. They sat like that for a while. The park went on around them, dogs, children, people with their Sunday purposes moving along the paths, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, which was fine. Which was better than fine. Which was, Vivienne thought, the best use of a silence she had encountered in recent memory. Then he said, quietly, I should have said it in Wiltshire. Yes, she said, you should have. I'm saying it now. I know, she said, better late. He made a sound, short, quiet, the sound of a man who has found something funny, and is slightly surprised to find it funny, and has not quite caught it before it escaped. She had heard this sound a handful of times in the past weeks, and had collected each instance with the care of someone who knows a rare thing when they encounter it. Vivienne, he said. Still unnecessary, she said. Entirely unnecessary, he agreed. I'm aware. She looked at the water. She let herself be entirely, simply, unreservedly glad. They walked home by the long route. Neither of them suggested it. They simply, at the point where the path divided, took the longer branch without discussion. in the way of people who are not yet ready for the walk to be over and don't need to say so. They talked about the estate, about her father's plans for the summer, about a book she had mentioned 2 Tuesdays ago that he had apparently gone and found in the interim, which she had not known and which arrived in the conversation as a small, unremarked thing that landed in her chest with the warmth of the specific. He had gone and found the book. He hadn't mentioned it. He had simply done it. She filed it away not as evidence, not as a data point to be weighed and assessed, as something she wanted to remember, for its own sake. At her door they stopped. He was still holding her hand, she realized. Or rather, she was still holding his, had been since the bench, had kept it through the long route and the talking and the magnificent chestnuts, and neither of them had remarked on it or changed it, and she thought this was, possibly, the most natural thing that had ever occurred between them, which said something about the distance they had come. "Thursday," he said. "There's a concert at the Whitmore House. I would like," he paused. Not the old pause, the searching pause, the new one, the considering one. "I would like to take you, and to sit beside you, and to be present for the whole evening." She looked at him. "Not at the wallpaper," he said. She felt the smile arrive, the private one, the real one, the one that had no performance in it, and she did not try to stop it. "Yes," she said, "all right." "Good," he said. He looked at her for a moment, the full-weight look, and beneath it something she could read now, something that had a name and that she had been given permission to know. "Vivienne," he said. "James," she said. He raised her hand and pressed it briefly, carefully to his mouth, not extravagantly, not with theater, in the precise and private way of a man who is being as honest with a gesture as he has been learning to be with words. Then he let go. He went down the steps. She watched him go. At the corner he paused just briefly, just a fraction of a second, and looked back. She was still in the doorway. He nodded once. She nodded once. He turned the corner. She went inside. She stood in the entrance hall. She thought about an engagement party and a pause, and a surname offered in place of a name. She thought about 3 years of standing outside a lit window in the careful cold. She thought about a letter and a Sunday morning, and a habit arriving before a man did. She thought about Wiltshire, about a library and You Look Better, and a man who had understood something important too late, and carried it incorrectly for 3 years, and had then, slowly, imperfectly, at considerable cost, and with her assistance and his mother's and his own eventual willingness, put it down and picked it up correctly. She thought about Tuesday walks and the long route home, and a hand held without discussion from a bench in April all the way to her door. She thought, "We got here." She thought, "It took us long enough." She thought with the complete and private and entirely uncomplicated gladness of a woman who has stopped standing outside and come in from the cold. Yes, but we got here. That evening she opened her journal. She turned to the page with the 2 questions and the small note at the bottom. What would it cost him to lose you? What would it cost you to trust him? Tuesday, 4 miles. He will be on time. He will say my name at least once unnecessarily. I will let him. I think this is going to be all right. She read it all. Then she turned to a new page. She wrote it was 2 words. She looked at them. Then she added below. He said my name 4 times today, 2 of them unnecessary. I counted. I always count. I think I will be counting for a very long time, and I find I don't mind at all. She closed the journal. She went to the window and looked at the April evening, the sky going its colors, the street below quiet and lit, the city doing its patient, ongoing thing outside the glass. She had been standing outside for 3 years. She was inside now. The difference, she thought, was everything. She had watched. She had waited. She had written the honest thing and held the door open and let him find his way through. And he had. Slowly and incorrectly and at considerable cost to both of them. But he had. That was the whole story. Or rather, that was where the story stopped needing to be told. Everything after was simply living. Which was, it turned out, exactly enough. The wedding had been in June. Not a large wedding. Vivienne had not wanted large, and James, when asked, had said he wanted whatever she wanted, and then she had looked at him in the particular way she looked at him when she suspected he was being agreeable rather than honest, and he had reconsidered and said, "Small. I want it small. I want to be able to see your face." So it had been small. 30 people in the church on a June morning with the light coming through the old windows in long colored pieces, and her mother in the gray silk she kept for occasions that required dignity, and Augusta crying in the second pew with the wholehearted abandon of a woman who feels things on behalf of others and considers it a service, and the Duchess of Ashford in the front row with her hands folded and her bright eyes doing the thing they did, registering everything, revealing almost nothing, except that once. When James said Vivienne's name in the vows with the steady and unhurried certainty of a man who has been practicing it as a habit for over a year, the Duchess had closed her eyes briefly and opened them again, and Vivienne, who had been watching because she watched everything, had seen it and had looked away quickly before her own composure became a question. It had been, by any measure, the right size. 2 years later, on a Tuesday in May, Vivienne woke early. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that James was already awake. She registered this before she opened her eyes, in the way she had learned to register his presence and absence, the warmth and weight and specific stillness of him, which were now as familiar to her as the sound of the house in the morning. He was lying on his back looking at the ceiling. "What time is it?" she said. "5:30, he said. "What are you thinking about?" A pause. This was the question she asked when she found him looking at ceilings, and he had learned, over 2 years, to answer it rather than manage it. He still took a moment. He was a man who needed the moment, who did not produce interior states quickly or without consideration, but he answered. "James," he said. She turned to look at him. "What about him?" "He asked me in his last letter whether I had been happy as a boy." He paused. He asked it simply. He wanted to know. He said his friend at school had been asking everyone whether their childhood was happy, and he wanted to know mine. Vivienne was quiet. "I didn't know how to answer," James said. "I've been thinking about it for a week." "What did you decide?" He was quiet for a moment. That the honest answer is complicated, and that he deserves an honest answer, and that I will need to think about how to make the complicated thing legible to an 11-year-old boy without either lying to him or burdening him with things he doesn't need to carry. Vivienne looked at the ceiling. "You could tell him," she said, "that you didn't know how to be happy then, that it was something you had to learn, and that you learned it late, but you learned it." He turned his head to look at her. "That's accurate," he said. "I know," she said. "It makes me sound human," she said. "It makes you sound human. He is 11. He will find that reassuring rather than diminishing." He looked at her for a moment, the full-weight look, which had not diminished in 2 years of daily use. If anything, it had deepened, become more itself, the way things do when they are practiced honestly over time. "Vivienne," he said. "That one was very unnecessary," she said. "It was completely unprompted." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it." She looked at the ceiling again, but she was smiling, the private one, the real one, the one she had stopped trying to manage approximately 18 months ago, when she had admitted to herself that managing it served no purpose because he knew it anyway, and she had been trying to protect something that didn't need protecting anymore. "Go back to sleep," she said. "It's 5:30. "You're not going back to sleep," he said. "No," she admitted, "but I was planning to lie here quietly and think about the garden." "What about the garden?" "The roses need cutting back. I've been putting it off because the weather hasn't been reliable." She paused. "Also, Thomas thinks the kitchen garden wall needs repointing, and I think he's right, and I've been working out how to tell you without it becoming a larger conversation about the east wall, which also needs attention, and which is going to cost more than either of us wants to think about before breakfast." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me now," he said, "before breakfast, then it's done." She turned to look at him. This was the thing she had not expected. Still, after 2 years, it arrived with a small surprise attached. Not that he listened, not that he engaged, but the specific quality of his engagement, the way he turned toward difficult things rather than away from them, the way he had learned to want the information rather than the managed outcome. She had asked for this. She had written it in a letter and held the door open and waited for him to walk through. He had walked through. Every day, in small ways and occasionally large ones, he walked through. She told him about the wall. He listened. He asked 2 questions, practical, specific, the kind that helped him understand the shape of the problem. She answered them. They lay in the early morning and talked about a wall in the east garden that needed repointing and the particular complication of the budget allocation and what Thomas had said about the mason from the village. And it was entirely mundane and completely ordinary, and she thought, as she sometimes thought, this is what I wanted. This, specifically. This exact thing. And I have it. James arrived on the Friday before the long weekend. He was 12 now, had turned 12 in February. A birthday that had been celebrated at Thornfield with a cake. Mrs. Beale had designed based on a detailed written specification James had apparently submitted to her 3 weeks in advance, which Mrs. Beale had received with complete seriousness and executed with total accuracy, which had produced in James a satisfaction so pure it had made Vivienne laugh at the table in the good way, the surprised way. The way that arrived when the world did something unexpectedly right. He came off the carriage with his satchel and his star chart, always the star chart. It was a different one now, more complex, with annotations in his own handwriting in the margins, and he shook James's hand on the steps and then turned to Vivienne and did something he had started doing at Christmas and had continued since. He hugged her. Briefly, practically, in the manner of a boy who has decided that this is the correct greeting for this particular person and has implemented it without discussion. She hugged him back. Every time, without fail, something in her chest did the warm, uncomplicated thing. How was the journey? She said. Long, he said. The road past Marlborough has a section that's badly maintained. Someone should write to the county surveyor. I'll look into it, James said. James, her James, who had once looked at rooms rather than people, said this with the casual ease of a man who has developed the habit of taking his son's observations seriously, which had happened so gradually over the past year and a half that Vivienne could not identify the moment it had become the default, only that it had. There's pie, Vivienne said. What kind? You'll have to ask Mrs. Beale. He was already heading for the kitchen door. That evening, the 3 of them had dinner together, just the 3 of them, which was how James preferred his first evening, and which they had learned to preserve for him. And afterward they sat in the drawing room with the long spring evening coming through the windows, and James told them about school with the selective thoroughness of a boy who has strong opinions about what is worth reporting and what is not. His astronomy teacher had retired. The new one was, in James's measured assessment, not yet fully informed about the subject but willing to learn, which is acceptable as a starting point. Vivienne looked at James over their son's head. James looked back at her. Something passed between them, silent, specific, the language of 2 people who have been paying attention to each other long enough to communicate in the shorthand of glances. And it was, she thought, approximately equal parts amusement and something older and more serious. The recognition of a boy who was, quite clearly and without apology, the particular product of his particular parents. Willing to learn, she thought, which is acceptable as a starting point. She thought, yes, it is. After James had gone to bed, later than the nominal bedtime, because the nominal bedtime was a flexible guideline rather than a rule on the first night, a policy that had evolved organically and had never been formally stated but was clearly understood by all 3 of them. Vivienne and James sat in the drawing room in the quiet of the house after a boy has gone upstairs. The fire was low. The windows were still light, the long May evening refusing to darken properly, the sky a deep luminous blue at the top and still gold at the horizon, the kind of evening that makes the world feel briefly, generously extended. He's going to be all right, Vivienne said. Yes, James said. Without hesitation, without the old pause, she looked at him. You didn't have to think about it. No, he said. He looked at the fire. I used to think about everything, every statement, whether it was accurate, whether I had sufficient information. He paused. I know he's going to be all right because I can see it, because I have been watching him for 2 years and I know what I'm looking at. Vivienne was quiet. You taught me that, he said. Watching, knowing what you're looking at. He turned to her. It took me longer than it should have. Most things do, she said. That doesn't mean they don't count. He looked at her with the full weight attention she had once counted on one hand and now simply lived inside. This quality of his regard that had been there all along. She understood, directed at ledgers and horizons and the fixed points of windows, and that was now, had been for 2 years, directed at her. Vivienne, he said. Was that one necessary, she said. He considered it with the serious attention he gave everything. Yes, he said, I believe that one was. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because I have been thinking all day since this morning about what I am going to write to James, about how to make the complicated thing legible. He paused. And I think the honest answer, the complete one, is that I didn't know how to be happy as a boy, and that I learned very late, and that I learned it because someone wrote me an honest letter and held a door open and waited to see if I would walk through. He looked at her. I want to tell him that. I want to tell him that the learning is possible, that it doesn't have to be early to count. He paused. And I wanted to say your name first because you are the start of that answer and I wanted you to know that before I said the rest. The drawing room was quiet. The fire settled. The sky outside continued its slow, extravagant refusal to become night. Vivienne looked at this man. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with the full attention that was the thing she had asked for and had been given, that had been the center of everything, the thing she had written a letter about and held a door open for and waited for and received. She thought about an entrance hall and a surname and a pause of 3 seconds. She thought about a Sunday morning and a hat held in both hands and I want to try. She thought about Tuesday walks and a bench in April and a hand held without discussion all the way home. She thought, we got here. She reached over. She put her hand in his. He turned his hand over immediately, the reflex it had become, practiced and reliable, and held on. Tell him, she said. Tell him exactly that. He will understand more of it than you think. Yes, James said, I think he will. They sat together in the long evening with the fire low and the sky refusing to darken and the house quiet around them. The particular quiet of a house with a boy upstairs and 2 people downstairs who have learned, at some cost and over some time, how to be present to each other. Not perfect. Not without the old distances occasionally announcing themselves, the old habits surfacing in moments of stress or tiredness, the necessary ongoing work of 2 people who had come to each other late and were still learning the full dimensions of what they had. But present, warm, in the rooms that had once been cold, filled, in the spaces that had once been empty. In the east-facing sitting room, Vivienne's room, the one with the morning light she had claimed in the first weeks of marriage with the calm certainty of a woman who knows where she does her best thinking, there was a desk by the window. On the desk, correspondence, a book open face down, a small vase of roses from the garden that needed cutting back, a journal with a worn cover. And beside the journal, propped against the vase, a single piece of paper, folded once, old enough to have softened at the creases. A letter. Not the one she had written. That was in James's desk in the study in the drawer he had told her about 6 months into their marriage with the matter-of-fact directness of a man reporting a fact he considers relevant. Your letter is in the left drawer. I have kept it there since January. I thought you should know. She had not asked to read it back. She had not needed to. She knew what it said. This was a different letter. This one had arrived 3 months after the wedding from Bath in the sharp, clear handwriting of the Duchess of Aldermere, who had written, I told you difficult men were usually worth it. I'm glad you decided to find out. Come and visit when you can. Bring him if you like. I have more questions. Vivienne had framed it. She had not told anyone she had framed it. She didn't think she needed to explain. Upstairs, James, the younger James, the one with the star chart and the cake specifications and the measured assessment of astronomy teachers, lay in his bed in the room that had always been his, in the house that had always been waiting for him to come home to, and looked at the ceiling with the open, considering gaze of a boy who is thinking about something. He was thinking about the question his friend had asked. He was thinking about his father's face at dinner tonight, the way he had listened, the way he had looked at Vivienne when he thought James wasn't watching, the specific quality of his attention across the table. He was 12. He did not have the words for everything he understood. But he understood this. His father looked at his stepmother the way the boy in the astronomy book looked at the sky, as though it were the most interesting thing, as though there were always more to see, as though looking itself were the point. James had watched this for 2 years. He thought it was probably the best thing he had ever seen. He closed his eyes. He slept. Downstairs, the fire went out slowly. The sky outside finally, reluctantly, became night. A warm night, a May night. The kind that smells of the garden through the open window and holds the day's warmth in it like a kept promise. Vivienne and James sat in the drawing room long after the fire had gone, in the dark that was not quite dark, in the quiet that was not quite quiet, in the way of two people who have somewhere to be in the morning and are in no particular hurry to get there. She thought about the journal question, what would it cost you to trust him, and the answer she had given herself on a night like this, 2 years ago in the east-facing room with the early decision and the cautious gladness. Everything, she had thought. It would cost everything. It had. She had paid it. She looked at the May sky through the window, dark blue and enormous and full of the things James was always writing to them about. The moons and the distances and the light that had been traveling for longer than anyone could quite imagine. She thought, worth it. She thought, entirely, completely, without qualification, worth it. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Beside her, James said her name quietly into the dark to no one and to her, the way he had said it in a hallway once, years ago, before he knew what he was doing. He knew now. She squeezed his hand. The night held them both. She had written the honest thing. She had held the door open. She had waited to see if he would learn to knock. He had. And in the end, in all the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable ends of all their ordinary days, that was the whole of it. That was everything. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.